Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of the 2024 Spring Resiliency Academy series. Folks are coming in now, and so I'll get started as additional folks are joining us. My name is Annette Oso. I'm the Managing Director of Resilient Virginia, and I want to first recognize my colleagues, Trish Porter, Bill Bond, and Ann Randolph-Whitlow, who worked on planning the event, and in addition, Jerry Cervenka, our technical advisor, who is assisting with production today. We'll have a few logistical notes first. The session will be recorded and shared with attendees shortly after the event is finished. You're invited to introduce yourself in the chat box, and in the meantime, attendees will remain on mute for the session. We are asking you to add your questions to the Q&A box, and they'll be addressed in a discussion period after the speakers' presentations. Note that we do have the transcription feature, and if you choose to use that, please do. As we go forward, I want to give a little background on the Resiliency Academy. Our series started in 2020 and has taken on a variety of themes each year. This year, we're focusing on a very timely topic, which is the integration of climate concerns in hazard mitigation planning. Our first session, which was called Understanding Climate in Virginia, set the stage for the next 3 webinars that will introduce FEMA's requirements for including climate and hazard mitigation plans, and will bring tools and resources together for developing your local plan. The agenda for today's workshop, I think, is on the next slide. We can get that going. Let me see. There we go. Of course, we're having a brief welcome. We're going to do a poll here at the very beginning to look at to give the speakers a sense of the different sectors represented today. I'll introduce the speakers, and after their presentations, as mentioned, we'll have the Q&A time. And then we'll have a roundup of our current activities, as well as the next in the Resiliency Academy series. So now we'll go forward and take a few minutes to do the poll. And we have a good number of folks on now to get that going. So question is, what type of organization do you represent? And we'll have about 30 seconds to do that. Okay, today we've got good representation from the business private sector, with, of course, regional local governments involved, and some community organizations and academic representatives. So thank you for being involved there in that short poll. We'd like to take a minute and thank our 2024 Resiliency Academy Series sponsor, the Mid-Atlantic CAP or RESA program. This grant, which supports both a spring and fall series, is made possible through funding from NOAA to Mid-Atlantic RESA, which then provided us with the support for the event. We also want to recognize the support of our current annual sponsors, and these include Marion Enterprises, a new sponsor, Weston and Sampson. Thank you very much. The ECT Inc. and Clark Nexon. We also want to thank our government, institutional, and individual members, as well as our generous donors, several generous donors who have supported us. Your support enables us to bring a wide range of resiliency resources to audiences around the state, and to convene such events as the Resiliency Academy, and along with our biennial conferences. So now we can go ahead and introduce today's guest speakers. Oh, okay, Rodney Bahner will be our first speaker. He is a community planner at the Mitigation Division of FEMA Region 3. Also, he and others are in the Virginia office, the FEMA Integration Team office, and he'll speak a bit more about that. Assisting localities with hazard mitigation planning. Previously, he worked as a city planner in Morgantown, West Virginia, and has a master's degree in regional planning and historic preservation from University of Oregon. Our next speaker will be Debbie Messmer, and we appreciate that she's been a speaker with us in previous Resiliency Academies. She's now Deputy Director of Grant Management and Recovery at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. She's worked with VDEM for 19 years as Grants Administrator, Project Coordinator, State Hazard Mitigation Officer, and now in her current position with Grants Management. She has overseen large amounts of funding going out for recovery, mitigation, preparedness, and other grants around the state. Previously, she worked in North Carolina doing similar work. So we will welcome Debbie to speak from what's happening from the VDEM point of view. Next, we have two speakers from Weston and Sampson. Anna Kimelblatt, who has 6 years of experience in resilience planning and floodplain management. And she's assisted communities up and down the East Coast, updating their hazard mitigation plans. Previously with Charleston County's floodplain manager, she was the Charleston County floodplain manager, and received her degree in environmental and sustainability studies from the College of Charleston. And having been there, I know the city has undertaken quite a few flood mitigation projects. Next, from Weston and Sampson is Janet Noonan as the senior project manager with the company, with nearly 20 years of experience in water resources planning, permitting, design, and construction. She has worked with any number of communities around the northeastern U.S. and both large and small on FEMA approved hazard mitigation plans, and focuses on climate resilience projects. She has a master's in engineering from Tufts University. Then we have an additional speaker, David Mandell, who is joining us from our neighboring state of Maryland. He's the Deputy Director, Office of Emergency Management for Annapolis. He, of course, is involved with emergency management programming in a variety of ways, including grants management and planning, and manages their hazard mitigation plan, and has had the experience now of updating the plan to include the new FEMA guidelines. And this is why we invited him to give his experience with how that has worked for the city of Annapolis. Of course, has coordinated quite a lot of grants and graduated from Washington University, and actually has a law degree from University of Maryland School of Law. So we have a great set of speakers here today. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started, asking Rodney Bahner to start the presentations.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Annette. As you heard, my name is Rodney Bahner, and I am a community planner, hazard mitigation community planner, and I work out of the Virginia FEMA Integration Team office. So I'm a member of a small team of FEMA staff that are assigned specifically to Virginia, and our focus is on grants and projects and response in the state. And specifically, my role is reviewing, primarily my role is reviewing hazard mitigation plans for compliance with the FEMA regulations. But in addition to that, one of our goals is outreach, getting out and providing the resources for communities, because we realize these plans and the updates every 5 years can be a big lift. But we'll jump in and give some, the insider look from the reviewer's point of view on what we're looking for, and opportunities to make your community more resilient. So just a brief intro to hazard mitigation planning. So we're at a pivotal moment in emergency management. So about 10 years ago, FEMA was managing an average of a little over 100 disasters a year. Today, it's quickly surpassing 300 a year. So FEMA's mandate to help people before and after disasters hasn't changed, but the challenge is growing, and climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of disasters. My main goal of this presentation is to just give a brief understanding and introduction to what we mean by future conditions, and introduce some methods for communicating to your constituents or communicating as a stakeholder about the importance of addressing future conditions and hazard mitigation plans. We'll briefly look at some options for integrating future conditions data into hazard mitigation plans, and I'll provide some sources and best practices around that integration of climate change into hazard mitigation planning. So the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 amended the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, what we call the Stafford Act, which created a framework for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to engage in hazard mitigation planning in order to receive certain types of emergency disaster and non-disaster assistance. And the requirements and procedures to implement hazard mitigation planning can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, the Stafford Act, Title 44, Chapter 1, Part 201. The intent is for mitigation planning to enable state, local, and tribal governments to identify natural hazards affecting them and identify actions and activities to reduce losses from those hazards through established a coordinated process to implement a hazard mitigation plan using a wide range of resources. So the mitigation plan serves as the foundation for other plans and planning processes in the state and community to integrate resilience and long-term risk reduction. This shown here is the 5-year planning wheel. Essentially, the community's hazard mitigation plans are required to be updated every 5 years, but the process is really ongoing. As soon as one plan is finished and adopted and approved, the work really can start to begin on that next update. We advise communities to do annual updates to see what's working, what mitigation actions, for example, are being accomplished and what's not. Setting you up or setting communities up ideally for a less painful update at their 5-year interval. Ideally, these plans aren't just sitting on a shelf. They're a living document that is intended to be flexible and changing as the environment and your community's needs are changing. A quick overview here of resilience, starts with the plan, and this is your community's, climbing the mountain to long-term community climate resilience. So you'll hear from Debbie Messmer about grants. I just want to introduce the idea that there is FEMA funding available to help with the planning, data analysis, data gathering. So when you're starting out your planning process or update, you're going to look at getting together a team, and you're looking for the resources to help fund it. You don't have to use FEMA funding, but we do provide that. So as your community sets out on this journey to resilience, the goal is to reach top decision makers, would be informed by the community priorities established through community conversations, and would use the planning process, which I'll go into more details, to navigate this journey. FEMA's role is to support you as a community, state, tribe, or local government in the journey to resilience. And your path to community resilience and climate resilience through choices that you make, especially around land use and community development, and to help lay the foundation for climate resilience when the mitigation plan is considering both current and future risks. As I mentioned, mitigation plans are a prerequisite for certain kinds of disaster and non-disaster grants. Any hazard mitigation plan process consists of 4 main elements. the planning process, which is the bulk of my presentation today, which includes the risk assessment and coming up with a mitigation strategy. And then we get into adoption, plan maintenance and implementation. So actually, seeing real world projects. What we mean by future conditions. The future conditions is how things will be in the future. So essentially, we're trying to predict the future, and we're going to look at changes in weather patterns, average temperature, and sea level rises that can bring about more extreme storms, droughts, wildfires, and other natural disasters. It can also mean changes to demographic trends, migration, moving populations away from hazardous areas, increases or decreases in density, the makeup of socially vulnerable populations. In addition, we're also considering how the community uses and develops land and the regulations around that, where we're putting people, businesses, and homes, whether that's in harm's way or towards safety. I'm not going to dive into the intricacies of climate change. I'm assuming that everyone has a basic understanding of climate change science. Alternatively, I will provide some resources that you may leverage at the end of the presentation. But predicting the future is hard. There's a lot of things that could happen that might change the type of location, seriousness, and frequency of hazards. And future conditions aren't just the weather. They include climate, population patterns, and how the land is changing due to factors like land sinking, seas and lakes rising or falling, channel migration, and landscape changes in other ways due to natural occurring processes like wildfires, and how those events are exacerbated by climate change. So changes to historic patterns and natural disasters can also mean demographic changes, where people are moving and leaving, and the exacerbation of historic inequities to historically marginalized population. Land use incorporates future populations where they live, work, and socialize, and also incorporates built and natural environmental changes, as well as the regulations such as zoning and building codes that your community uses and develops to steward the land. None of this planning is done in a vacuum from politics, so we'll look at ways to keep decision makers informed and the community at large to ideally buy in and be informed of their hazards and the plan to address those hazards. Recent changes were released in 2023 that specifically speak to climate change. These came from FEMA and are really looking at future conditions and how that can be addressed and needs to be addressed. So what we want to see is a risk analysis of hazard, looking at historic data, current and future conditions that includes climate change. Mitigation plans can be updating them can seem daunting, but there are resources and tools to help guide you. As I mentioned in the introduction, I will try to provide those as we move through this presentation, and you'll hear from other speakers that are implementing these and their best practices that you can borrow. This guidance includes a breakdown of what you will need to have in your plan, and includes the local plan review tool and these guides that you see on the screen now. Really, everything I'm touching on could be its own presentation. These handbooks are great resources that go into explaining what's needed and required, and resources to help you meet those requirements. So then we get into opportunities to incorporate climate change into hazard mitigation planning. So the initial stage is risk identification and planning. So how are you identifying the hazards? How are you reaching out to the community? And is there opportunities to align other community plans with the hazard mitigation plan? Then how can our regulations and projects help to incorporate future conditions in the project designs and rules? And briefly, just throwing out there that there are design and nature-based solutions that incorporate and consider climate change. So through the planning process, we're really looking at how you potentially bringing in the whole community. like as I mentioned, climate change is, occurring in the environment, but at the end of the day, it's affecting the people. So how can we look at, what we want to see in a hazard mitigation planning process is as much outreach to the community as possible to increase awareness hazards and to hear from the community and learn from their lived experience. So as I mentioned, hazards change over time, and the probability of future events needs to be included in your hazard mitigation plan. So here is the specific language that what we're looking at. Does the plan include a description of the type, location, extent of all natural hazards that can be affect the jurisdiction or jurisdictions if you have a multi-jurisdiction plan? Does it include information on previous occurrences and the probability of future hazard events? This is just one specific requirement, but climate change considerations can be implemented throughout the plan. I didn't want to get too regulation heavy in this presentation, but I did want to pull out at least this one aspect of our required. Again, those planning guides will go into further detail about each of the required elements, and provide guidance to how those can be met. You can work with your VDEM, regional planners, as well as FEMA staff with questions or resources to address these required elements. There's a future presentation coming up as part of the series where one of the presenters will dive into more data sources, but this is a big need and a big gap that FEMA recognizes and is working to address. There are a lot of sources that you can reach out to, including your state hazard mitigation plan, climate adaptation plans. NOAA has a storm events database. We have inventory, and I feel like there's new data and GIS resources coming out every month that are new or improved. They're helping to, communities get an idea of the hazard and the risks that they're going to be facing now and in the future. Additional data sets are provided here. So if you're leading the risk assessment, you can reference these sorts of materials to understand how climate change may affect hazard intensities and probabilities. And these future conditions will need to be included in the hazard probability descriptions that address that B1 standard I showed earlier. We also want to look at, climate change is one component of future conditions, but we're also looking at population changes and land use changes. Is building occurring? Is building receding from an area? We don't recommend this. There's not a specific source that we recommend. It will really depend on your community and your needs and scale. One recommendation is to, try to include multiple data sources and climate planning tools, similar to, like hurricane projections, giving you almost like a spaghetti model of what you can trying to predict for the future. Predicting the future is hard. So when we get into the risk assessment, this is, a critical part of your hazard mitigation plan. Conditions such as climate, population demographics, and land use change need to be considered through your risk assessment and how these changes are going to alter your jurisdiction's vulnerabilities. The mitigation planning regulations require the consideration of probability of future events. It requires the plan to update reflect changes in development. So both of these sides are critical to your risk profile, so your hazards and your exposure. Communities need to account for climate change and other future conditions when assessing the probability of future events. It's no longer helpful just to look back at the last few years or further. Hazards are changing fast, and the plans that need to account for these rapidly changing climate and hazard events. So when we pull, we look at the hazards. The next part of this risk assessment is how are these hazards going to affect our community assets. And again, people is a big one here, but obviously structures, natural resources, our critical facilities and community lifelines, and the economy. This is why it's so important in the early stage of your hazard mitigation planning to pull in integral stakeholders that can speak to each of these types of assets. Look at what tools you already have or data you already have available around buildings, building permits, things that are happening in your community, so you understand what's happening, and we can get a better picture. You can get a better picture of your vulnerability. So here we see the risk, is your overlapping hazards and community assets. So you are, looking at future conditions on the climate change side and how that's going to impact your hazards, but also how is climate change going to impact your people and community assets? What's happening to, your community at large, your business community, and underserved communities, as well as, that includes socially vulnerable populations. These hazards are shown to affect, marginalized populations more substantially and significantly. So do you have an aging population? Do you have an aging housing stock that, could be impacted during a heat event? These are all the considerations that you need to take a look at during this planning process, and that we want to just see, documented in detail out what was pulled and what was the thought process to work through this risk assessment. So just listing out additional data sources for community assets, and these are all available in our guiding policy documents. For the sake of time, I'm going to quickly move through. Another important part of your hazard mitigation plan is, your methods for assessing impacts. You're starting with historical, looking at exposure and future scenario. So through all these processes, there's opportunities to go above and beyond, including climate change, but at the minimum, we want to see the, relevant addressing climate change through the risk assessment, community capabilities, and ultimately through your strategies and actions. Briefly, mitigation actions can include these are 4 breakdowns of the types of actions. Once you've identified, your assets that are most at risk, you can look at plans and regulations. How can we, plan? How can we regulate and go above and beyond? For example, you have floodplain maps in your community. If you're near a flood hazard area, can you go above that? Or is there a lived experience in the community where we're experiencing flooding that isn't necessarily mapped? And is there an opportunity to regulate around that to prevent future assets from being located in those areas? The brick and mortar structure projects, natural systems. I mean, these are natural processes that are happening. There's opportunities to incorporate green infrastructure and other types of project opportunities there that you should consider when you're listing out potential mitigation actions. And then education and awareness, making sure that your community knows what's happening and has the opportunity to hopefully participate and become informed so that they can make the right choices if a hazard occurs. For the sake of time, I'll avoid repeating myself, but just to kind of review, this is where we really want to see climate, future projections and climate change incorporated into the plan. At the beginning, through the planning process, in the risk assessment, looking at future projections, and your mitigation strategy. So projects that run that gauntlet of opportunities that were listed previously. So where to start? Reach out to your VDEM and FEMA staff. We have many guides available. We recognize that this is a difficult lift for many communities, so we have a library of resources that are available. This is a great resource that's available online. It helps provide an overview of climate science and regional impacts and potential tools. Additionally, we have a resource of resources You can, I'm happy to provide these as possible. You can, Google or do an internet search for these and pull it up. Another great resource there. And, for looking at ways to, communicate about climate hazard and to bring in different groups, this is another great resource, Building Alliance for Climate Action. An additional along those lines is this resource, Long-Term Community Resilience Exercise Resource Guide. Some great tips for providing a common framework for understanding and providing a good starting point for developing and making major changes to your hazard mitigation plans. And then this is our, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, our local hazard mitigation planning resources. This is a whole list that is available out there. Additional data resources, as I mentioned, there's a lot of work being done in the private and academic sectors and public sectors to get the best data out there that is easily and freely accessible. Equity resources, there's some resources to reach out, economic screening tools, mapping data resources that are great for your mitigation plan. Lots of nature-based resources as well. U.S. Army Corps, EPA has some guides and design concepts that can help with the brainstorming around mitigation projects. Lots more resources. Just about to finish up here. If you're interested in learning more about what FEMA Region 3 is doing, we have a about monthly coffee break webinar. It does provide some professional credits, about an hour long, and the topics are all related to mitigation planning, often related to climate change as well. So I'd encourage you to check that out and register for upcoming events. And that is the end of my presentation. Happy to provide those resources or answer any questions. It's a lot to go over, but hopefully I look forward to hearing what our other presenters have and best practices for how they're incorporating climate change. So thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Rodney. We're going to do a quick little exercise here of engaging the attendees with a Mentimeter poll. And Trish has put that up, Trish Porter, in the chat, Mentimeter link. So politics, funding, data, uncertainty, lack of local data. And I know that the question of gathering the data, again, there are a lot of tools. It's a matter of, and a lot of sources. It's a matter of being able to, I think, get enough capacity, particularly if you're a small location, smaller jurisdiction, to put the pieces together, the data, etc. So that gives you a quick snapshot there. And with that, we'll share that again along with the slides and the recordings in just a few days here. So with that, we want to go forward with Debbie Messmer's presentation and have her speak about the particular resources coming out of Virginia Department of Emergency Management.
So first, thank you, Annette. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you, Rodney. That's a great amount of information regarding the planning process and all that's kind of required to start the planning process and to continue with it, especially how to incorporate the climate change aspect into the mitigation grant planning. So what I wanted to do is kind of take what Rodney had and bring in, as Annette mentioned, kind of how do you then, you've identified climate change in your planning process. You've also identified some potential projects that maybe you could use, and then how do you go about getting funding, and or what types of projects could we potentially look at? So first, I'd like to just talk about there's multiple grant opportunities through FEMA, through other agencies that incorporate climate change or incorporate any sort of mitigation and other hazard related projects. I think personally the focus right now is really on BRIC, which is building resilient infrastructure in communities. Reason being multitude of reasons why that there's a big focus here, but mostly because there's just a lot of money available within BRIC, whereas the other grant opportunities that we might have here, the funding amounts are limited. 2 years ago, FEMA did open up flood mitigation assistance to be a larger opportunity for sub-applicants. So they offered $800 million available for flood-related projects, which is fantastic. But you really have to tie your project to a flood-related mitigation. So it can be a little bit more difficult in terms of climate change and how your it can be more difficult depending on what sort of project you're looking at in regards to climate change. So I'm going to focus on BRIC, and I'm going to give a brief little overview about that and then kind of talk about some project opportunities that are out there. So BRIC is an annual grant, and it is focused on climate resilience, and it's focused on large-scale infrastructure projects. So, and the reason it's focused on large-scale infrastructure projects is because the funding is available for large-scale infrastructure projects. There are also opportunities for a smaller project. And when I say large scale, I mean anywhere from 10 million to $100 million. But there's plenty of opportunities for smaller projects as well. But I think the draw of BRIC is the fact that there is a lot of funding available. So this past year, so 2 years ago, FEMA made $2 billion available. And this past year, which applications were just submitted to FEMA at the end of February, there was $1 billion available. So over the last, I guess this will be the fourth cycle, there's been $4.5 billion available for BRIC funding. And what we're seeing are a lot more projects, but also some really large scale infrastructure projects that have been obviously needed across the country. So for those of you who don't know BRIC, it is nationally competitive. So there is a set aside amount of $2 million for each state, but each state puts in one application that encompasses all the sub-applications that they have received. So for example, in Virginia, we have one large application. We will have sub-applications that fit into the set-aside amount of $2 million. And then we will have our larger scale project applications, sub-applications that don't fit into that $2 million set-aside. So this past year, I think we submitted around $300 million in Virginia in sub-applications. So let's talk about the $2 million set aside. Rodney talked about mitigation planning. Right there, a good opportunity to either start your plan or to update your plan is using BRIC funding. So the $2 million set aside can be used by localities that apply to the state to update their plan, to enhance their plan, to start a plan. So there's multitude of opportunities in regards to mitigation planning. The other opportunity is for capability and capacity building projects. So for example, you've gone through your planning, you've identified an area that you want to work climate resilience or flood resilience. You've identified this area or this potential project, but you're not quite sure what it is that needs to happen and how much it's going to cost. So those are capability capacity building projects, really, or maybe even you don't know, you've gone through your planning process, you know there's a lot of problems out there, but you want to hone in on a specific area, or you want to hone in on a specific hazard to address. Those are capability and capacity building projects. So each state is offered funding opportunities to fund those types of projects. So in terms of large scale projects, or just any structural projects that don't fall into the $2 million set aside, there is a $50 million federal share cap on projects. So the project can be as large as you want. In fact, we recently, I think this past year, we submitted $100 million project. So it'll be a 50-50 cost share, $50 million if it's awarded, $50 million by the feds, $50 million by the local government. So $50 million federal cost share cap on all projects. There is a minimum, or I'm sorry, there is a maximum 75% federal share. So the remaining share, 25%, or if you overshare, the remaining share is handled by the locality or the eligible sub-applicant that's applying. So the state does not contribute any matching funds to a BRIC application. So to touch briefly, over the last 4 years, and then BRIC actually falls on the heels of PDM. So over the last 23 years, PDM, pre-disaster mitigation funding, and BRIC funding have always kind of had a component of equity or helping more rural communities. So priority is given to what are called EDRCs and CDRZ zones, CDR zones. So EDRCs are economically disadvantaged rural communities. So there's a certain definition that applies to what a community that is an EDRC. They have to be smaller than 3,000 people. They have to have a certain income requirement, and they have to be rural. And then there's also CDRs. And this is new, coming out of FEMA over the last 2 years or over the last year, I guess. And so there are specific areas. They're not even counties, cities, towns. They're areas that are designated a CDR. I'm gonna have to pass on the actual acronym. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know the Z is zone. And there was their study done, and these areas are areas that FEMA has determined to be a vulnerable population area. So there is an opportunity for additional cost shares that go up to 90% for communities that are identified as EDRCs or CDRs. And then BRIC basically is eligible for state agencies, local governments. They're eligible to apply, and then they're eligible to benefit from the BRIC funding opportunities. So let's talk about some climate change project ideas. So there's a couple of different ways to look at some project ideas. You can look at smaller scale projects that are directly related to climate change, or you can look at a piece of your project being related to climate change so that you can have a larger scale project that maybe addresses other types of hazards that you're looking at as well. So some ideas are sustainable buildings, taking it one step further from mitigation and adding a sustainability piece to a project. So like I talked about, having a large scale project and either not just saying we're going to mitigate this problem, but we're going to mitigate it in a way that can address climate change as well. Looking to electricity generation through other means than generators. So for years, we've been pushing generators as just having a backup power source. And now let's talk about other electricity generation sources as well. And then taking into consideration sea level rise in any coastal area project. So, and lastly, planning, zoning, and floodplain management centered on climate change and resiliency. So those are project ideas that can certainly, and of course, there's many more. And as Rodney noted, the resources that are out there relating to climate change are numerous. So when you have your project, I just focused on this particular criteria. So what happens is your sub-application is provided to the state. The state then puts in one big application for all their sub-applications. And then your sub-application is scored. It's scored two ways. It's scored on a quantitative criteria and a qualitative criteria. And as you can see in the qualitative criteria, and I won't get into the quantitative one, but in the qualitative criteria, it clearly identifies climate change and other future conditions. So how your sub-application will, and then do the following things that are listed here. And this is extremely important. This is why it's a great reason to incorporate climate change into your project, because there is a point system awarded, and how you're addressing climate change and other future conditions are assessed at the qualitative criteria time. So it's a good idea to incorporate climate change and then to identify the future conditions of your project as well. So that's all that I have. And I'll turn it back over to Annette.
All right. Thank you, Debbie. That was very instructive, I think, for getting down a little further into that fantastic funding opportunity. And then we want to move on. I know we've had some questions, and again, we'll if we have a few minutes at the end, we'll address those on various aspects of the funding, particularly. But let's go forward with our Weston and Sampson speakers, who are going to speak to some of the experience they've had in the region, both Mid-Atlantic and I think East Coast regions, on working with hazard mitigation planning, and that includes climate aspects. So I believe that Anna is going to share the slides now. Let's see here.
Yes.
And it'll be Anna and Janet speaking here. There we go.
All right, y'all.
Take it away.
Thank you so much to Rodney and Debbie for setting such a great stage for us. We're going to be talking today about integrating climate change into hazard mitigation plans, and we're going to take it chapter by chapter today. So typically the way that we structure a hazard mitigation plan is to contain all of the necessary components from FEMA. So we'll have an introduction, a chapter on the planning process, the risk assessment, a section on community capabilities, a section that contains the mitigation actions, a section on plan maintenance, the adoption resolution, and then appendices that contain additional information. So we want to look today at how we integrate climate change into each of these sections. And so we'll be sharing some examples, some case studies, some lessons learned, and some tips and tricks.
At the beginning of developing the plan, we really like to, in the introduction, set the scene for all of those participating in the planning process. You know, why are we doing this, and why does this plan include climate change? And Anna's going to talk more about some of the nuances there. But we also make sure we are defining key terms so that there's clarity and transparency. And we actually do try the goal setting process towards the beginning of the planning. You know, the FEMA guidance does talk about that in the mitigation strategy, but we really like to do that up front so that there is time for those involved to really think through, what does this plan need to accomplish? And in setting the goals, we are encouraging climate change thinking. So we can share some examples of how that might look. This is a slide showing an example of an introduction section in a hazard mitigation plan that has some definitions, right? So natural hazards, vulnerability, hazard mitigation, climate change, and resilience. Some of the places we get definitions to include here are from FEMA guidance that Rodney was mentioning, the state hazard mitigation plan, other regional or local HMPs that are recent, as well as relevant local plans. Some communities may already have defined these terms in a climate action plan or risk and vulnerability assessment that was specific. So just being consistent with other plans is a piece of the puzzle. And in goal setting, we're also integrating the climate change thought process. This is an example from a large city in the Northeast. And that community had in its previous plan a long list of goals that were very detailed and very wordy. And in doing a HMP update, decided to truncate the goals, make them much more communicable. They could be easily translated and understood at all levels of government. And 3 of these goals include climate change considerations. That would be goal 2, increase resilience by protecting and enhancing natural resources. 3, implement hazard mitigation and climate adaptation projects that meet strategic priorities. And 5, ensure that essential services and infrastructure will function during and after a hazard event and prepare essential services for projected climate change. And so there's places you can look, variety of sources to get ideas for goals, certainly your previous HMP and thinking about how to update those, but also looking at examples, get ideas about how to communicate succinct, measurable, and meaningful goals for your jurisdiction.
In Chapter 2, the planning process, FEMA typically provides guidance on who to engage in the process. That ranges from neighboring communities to academic institutions to local businesses. But typically we have 3 main groups involved, and that's the core team or the steering committee, an extended stakeholder group, and the general public. And the first thing we do when we're doing a hazard mitigation plan update is develop the engagement plan. This is a plan that covers engagement, public engagement from kickoff to project completion so that we know exactly who to engage and when. Not everyone has to be at every meeting, nor should everyone be at every meeting. And so this engagement plan helps us tailor the engagement to the specific audiences that we want to reach at that time. So this is an engagement plan from a large city in the Northeast. You can see that it blocks out week by week exactly what type of engagement is going to be going on that week, from meetings to the public survey to website updates. We've also found success in developing a street team of community liaisons to help us talk to other members of the public about climate change. These street team liaisons are trusted members of the community that have a wide reach and are well connected. So they can help spread the word, promote participation, bolster meeting attendance, share feedback between the jurisdiction and the community, and help gain buy-in from the community. So when we talk to these groups about climate change, it's extremely important, especially if people don't believe in climate change, to talk to them in a way that they can understand. We want them to be supportive of the planning process, so we have to talk about it in a way that's palatable to them. This became very apparent to us in one of our cases down in Georgia. We were met with some pushback from members of the community regarding the words climate change, the words sea level rise. So we had to quickly pivot a little bit in that scenario to adjust the way that we were speaking about climate change. We removed climate change from the public survey, and that made it a little more palatable to the public. And instead, we've found that asking more general questions is a great way to talk to those that might not be on board or have bought into the whole climate change scenario. So we can ask questions such as, how has the weather affected you? How has the weather changed since you were a kid? What do you worry about happening in the future? We've also found that having localized, tangible, specific examples of natural hazards on hand to cite is extremely helpful. Like I mentioned, this case study, this was a county down in Georgia that is just sort of beginning to feel the impacts of development and climate change. It's becoming more of a bedroom community rather than a rural community. And so this was a really interesting scenario for us where we had to adapt a little bit.
And thinking about the asset inventory, like Rodney was talking about, you have to think about not only present but future assets, and that includes thinking about, development and changes that are coming in populations. When we're developing the inventory, we like to have climate change be part of the thought process, but as Anna mentioned, it may not be as overt. We may be playing, guiding questions, sharing ideas like, what about when there's potentially a hotter summer? Who are the people that might be impacted more during that event? Or talking about, are there natural resources that might be more resilient, help us be more resilient to flooding or to heat, right? So thinking about, people might say, we want to preserve the tree canopy, or we want to make sure wetlands are protected. So it's just part of the dialogue that we use as developing the asset inventory. We also, in the asset inventory, do like to get into this question about have there been any changes in development that would increase or decrease your jurisdiction's risks? And technically, this is part of the plan update requirements, but this is a good place to start thinking about it because you're thinking about a change in development that has happened since the last planning. So there are assets there. And there's a number of ways to think about this question, all sorts of data, right? Mapping, building permits, thinking about whether local code updates have been made or changes in risk-related data. One way, Anna's going to talk about one way we've looked at this to help support this discussion.
So when we're doing the asset inventory, one of the questions we're trying to answer is, are there more assets at risk now due to climate change than there were in the past? And one way we can get at that answer is by looking at development, like Janet mentioned, that has occurred since the previous 5-year update. So in this table, this is an example. This data is from Charleston County, South Carolina. So the blue column is data from the 2019 Hazard Mitigation Plan, and the green column is data from the 2024 Hazard Mitigation Plan. And if you look in the gold boxes, you can see that total site-built structures has increased from 2019 to 2024. And not only that, but total structures in the special flood hazard area has increased from 2019 to 2024, both in the AE and BE zones. So we can assume that there are more assets at risk now, and new mitigation actions should be explored that provide protection to these assets against climate change.
So the risk assessment, the defining natural hazards, thinking about asset vulnerabilities, and discussing the impacts to the community could be its own whole day, right, session. So we're actually not going to get into a lot of detail here. We're also aware that Resilient Virginia has a great session coming up, I think on May 2026, I believe it is, that has more about tools for climate change and hazard mitigation planning. That would be data sources that go into this. But those hazard descriptions have to include a discussion on the probability of future events, including impacts from climate change. And we use climate projection tools and maps to then identify the assets or areas that may be at risk now or in the future, including from climate change. And I think the thing we wanted to touch on is just how do you approach, there's so many resources, there's so much data. How do you approach including climate change in your vulnerability analysis? We typically recommend looking at the state plan. Virginia's plan does have a great amount of climate change information in it. There's also, of course, all those other resources, but we start there, supplement with national data where appropriate, and then there may be regional or local data that would supersede the state or national data. So some communities may have done flood prediction mapping that looks at present and anticipated future flood scenarios or anticipated and future heat scenarios. There may also be other local plans that have augured into a component for a particular hazard. So that's sort of the order of operations we follow. When there's doubt, we reach out to our FEMA or state emergency management agency and have a discussion about particular sources of data or applicability from their perspective, just to create clarification. Certainly no small task. And then thinking about the impacts on the community and describing those, a lot of great sources. We always look at the state plan. Again, there's a lot of narrative that is in that plan that can be tailored to the community. We find that the public input process, the surveys, give us a lot for this. Great quotables, great stories. They really help bolster the impacts discussion. We also find that the staff of the jurisdiction have all sorts of experiences to share from their response and jurisdictional responsibilities perspective. We scan through news articles and find stories about recent events or and how that's impacted the community, and always checking out the last hazard mitigation plan.
So chapter 5 is typically for us the capabilities assessment. And the capabilities assessment is a self-assessment to determine a community's current ability to mitigate hazards and then to identify existing gaps in those abilities. Capabilities that FEMA requires you to look at are the administrative and technical capabilities, planning and regulatory capabilities, financial capabilities, and their education and outreach capabilities. So we have found that FEMA has a worksheet actually that for communities to conduct this self-assessment, and that worksheet is easily transformed into a Google form or Microsoft form survey that can be sent around to different department heads of the community. This is an example of a survey that we did for a small town in Massachusetts. And these surveys really help because they help determine different departments' preparedness for climate change. And we can ask them some supplemental questions in these surveys that help us get at the climate change aspect a little bit further, such as, is there political will and support to prepare the community for climate change? Does staff have the necessary training to respond to and prepare for climate hazards? Does the community have the information it needs to adequately prepare for climate change impacts? And what is the community already doing to combat climate change? So these surveys are really helpful for us to get to sort of gauge where a community is at, what are their existing capabilities, and then what gaps exist that need to be filled in order for them to better respond to climate change.
In the mitigation actions chapter, there are sort of 3 key ways we integrate climate change. And the first one is coming up with mitigation actions that are specifically targeted for climate change. So some examples are listed on this slide: develop a climate action plan, perform a study or model to understand current and future flooding, complete a review of local code for climate resilience enhancement, create cooling areas at locations where there may be predicted extreme heat, update a local climate change vulnerability assessment to include newest data, and using adaptive management approaches for community activities to reflect changes in seasons and weather, excuse me. Another way that we reflect climate change in the mitigation actions is including it as a factor in the prioritization process. So after you've listed and come up with all of the mitigation actions, there are a number of ways you can prioritize, but some communities will include a specific kind of column, like, does this action specifically address climate change? And you could, in this example below, you can see each action is getting a yes, no, or maybe. And there's actually a numerical system behind this that calculates all of the input, calculates the score for each action against all of this criteria to help prioritize which ones are most important to proceed with in the 5-year plan. And the third way that we do it is in finally presenting the list of mitigation actions to the public and to decision makers, is to, in that table, have a column or 2 that target climate change. And that may be whether, if your goals specifically had a climate change goal, that might be a place where it's listed, or maybe you add a separate column that this action specifically addresses climate change. And that helps communicate the messaging to, again, the public, elected and appointed officials, and other stakeholders involved.
So FEMA requires that you have a plan for maintenance of the hazard mitigation plan. And we know that climate change is occurring rapidly. The plan must be updated every 5 years, but that 5-year update may not be frequent enough to capture important newly released climate data or projections. So when we're working with communities, we typically recommend smaller annual updates and quarterly meetings to keep the committee engaged. We recommend that communities review the plan for updates after a disaster and consider reviewing the plan after new data is released. We have found that these smaller annual updates really lighten the lift of the 5-year update. One community that has had a lot of success with these annual updates is Charleston County, South Carolina. They have quarterly committee meetings with multi-department representation. So they have everyone from planning, emergency management, public works, et cetera. Each department sends a rep. They annually update their hazard frequencies and occurrences. It's a multi-jurisdictional plan. There's actually 17 jurisdictions involved in the Charleston Regional Hazard Mitigation Plan. So there's a lot of moving parts here. But they do conduct annual updates to each jurisdiction's mitigation action table. Each jurisdiction provides the progress report on their mitigation action table each year. And they updated the plan after the release of new flood maps as well in 2021. So we have found that with this quarterly meeting schedule and these lighter, smaller annual updates, it really helps with that lift every 5 years. We just did their 5-year update in early 2024, and it was quite a breeze.
And the last way we have incorporated climate change into the plan is in the adoption chapter. FEMA does have a plan adoption sample in the guidance documents that were mentioned earlier in the session. And there isn't a specific call out for climate change, but if you were desiring, you could certainly modify this example from FEMA and add any kind of acknowledgement that climate change is predicted to affect the frequency, duration, and intensity of natural hazards and how it will impact the jurisdiction. And we really do appreciate the time today, and we've provided our contact information, and we will move on to the next speaker. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to move right to our last speaker, David Mandell, again from Annapolis, where we have, from a local government perspective, how it works to go ahead and integrate some of the new climate requirements. So please do go ahead, Dave. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
You are up.
Can you?
Your slides are up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Annette, and the team at Resilient Virginia. Fantastic speakers so far. Let me start my video. There we go. I'll try to be brief considering the time. My hazard mitigation plan in the City of Annapolis Office of Emergency Management, I serve as Deputy Director, was one of the first to be reviewed under the new guidelines in like March and April of 2023, right when things got going in terms of the new guidance. Really interesting perspective so far. I guess my piece to add is the local side of it in terms of what we saw from a hazard mitigation plan developer side. So I'll kind of give some brief nuggets in terms of things that we experienced and changes that we made and FEMA responses as well. So we always were careful to include a wide range of personnel in our planning committee, local, state, county government, and so forth. We did that this time around, but we also did a little bit more. FEMA's very specific in requesting representatives from businesses. We didn't have as many businesses as you know we probably should have at the beginning. So we added some businesses, academics, and those who work with vulnerable populations. Obviously, equity and diversity is a big factor these days, and that had to be addressed. Okay. Health and equity, as I mentioned, equity is a big thing. We added a stakeholder meeting that was entirely focused on public health and social equity, where we incorporated data, plan integration, new section on it. We have a new chapter on emerging infectious diseases. I'm sure you can't imagine why, because our previous plan was pre-COVID, and that was not on our radar screen. So it went from, you know, not listed to a very concerning threat. Integration is another major factor. Plan integration with other plans that you may have in your jurisdiction. It was always something of interest, but we're seeing more scrutiny in terms of expectations that those are addressed and explained and harmonized. Okay, the climate change requirement was talked about, so I won't belabor that point, but I will say from a local perspective, my idea about it is it can be very overwhelming, right? Because climate change is developing, it is changing. How do you address it? Next year, you're going to have different, you know, standards or predictions. You know, so my thought on it is, at least my local experience is, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, you know, 100% confident. It's something that we all have to address as it relates to every hazard, and that's what FEMA in my experience is looking for. How did you address it hazard by hazard in terms of your approach? Not that you had, you know, concrete plans for every possible prediction level of sea level rise or climate change and so on. Okay, FEMA programs, there's the community rating system and the National Flood Insurance Program. We added an appendix to covering both of these areas in order to maximize the benefits and participation in these initiatives after a long preparation period. Annapolis joined the community rating system just last month, as a matter of fact. And that is something that is asked about on some grant applications. So we wanted to make sure to do that. Saves homeowners money on flood insurance as well. So by you can set up your hazard mitigation plan in a way that maximizes the number of points you get for the community rating system. It really makes it ready to go when it's time to put that application together. So I wanted to point out, everyone wants to know when you give a presentation like this, what did FEMA like about your plan? What did FEMA not like about your plan? So I'm giving you all the skinny here, folks, to benefit from the experience that I had. Here are the highlighted best practices that FEMA highlighted as such in our draft plan. We gave a detailed list of summaries in terms of changes since the last update. We included a lot more information on the essential facilities vulnerability database with images and locations and all kinds of other information. This chart here on the screen, they found very interesting because it goes through all our hazards that we had decided to rank and compared them from the previous hazard mitigation plan in 2018 to the current in 2023, and it's linked to the statistics in terms of how they got there from low to medium to high, or what have you. So that was something that was flagged as a best practice. We also included NFIP capability assessment worksheets inside the plan. And one of the things we try to do in Annapolis is to make our plan as actionable as possible. I really believe in everyone needs a plan, and it makes us eligible for the grants and all that. But we have to do this. So let's make it work for us. Let's set up our future projects. Let's make it as easy to build on as we possibly can, whether you're going for the community rating system or working with the NFIP or building projects, applications with brick or wherever else you're going with it. Here is where they FEMA pointed out required revisions. They sent it back. We had, I think, 3 submissions, two sets of revisions were required. So here's I specifically always mention this because I'd like to make sure everyone takes advantage of the experience that we had, and you can see where FEMA said, no, you need more information in these particular areas. They asked for more information on the stakeholders. What is their involvement, not just names and titles, and what are they doing as part of the process. They asked for the risk assessment to describe the vulnerability of plan participants to each hazard. So you look at each hazard and have to break it up by each of the types of plan participants that we had. So that's just more detail than we had envisioned as we started out. And I'd like to mention, we were trying to figure this out as we were going. We didn't know until the very last minute that we'd even be subject to the new rules, because we had started the process a year before, and FEMA was trying to figure it out as well. So in terms of additional impacts that they want us to take a look at, obviously effects of climate change, that's been discussed, change in population patterns, density, just basically changes in demographics and details like that since the previous plan. Location information for each identified hazard and the demographic information I mentioned being incorporated into the risk assessment. Okay. Here are some selected, there's so many data sources. I presented this slide somewhere else, and someone was texting me saying, you forgot a 20th source. Obviously there's a million sources. Many are good, and I'm in Maryland, so obviously these are based in Maryland, many of them, and may not be applicable to you. But the point is, there are tons of databases and sources that can be helpful in terms of developing your models and your plan. Okay. A lot of the stuff we talked about, I have here, have been either covered, or we don't need to get into all this detail. Yeah, I'm going to skip right there. The one thing I do want to mention right here before I go, in the interest of time, is definitely encourage you to incorporate as much feedback as you possibly can. Make sure you allow yourself enough time. FEMA gets 45 days, as you see here, to review the submission, and they will take it, in my experience. the local mitigation plan review tool that I've kind of posted a snapshot here, it was required when I submitted. We had our plan, we submitted, it was good, and they said, that's great, but you have to fill out this plan review tool that shows how the plan complies with each of the requirements. So my advice is fill it out as you go, so you don't have to have a completed draft plan and then you have to go back and start, showing how the plan was compliant. You can fill it out as you go. It'll save a lot of time. Okay, we talked about grants, so I don't need to belabor that point. Remember your audience, that it's not just FEMA folks, but the general public as well. And that's what I have for you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. That was great. Thank you for going through that relatively quickly. And again, people have been asking in the chat and Q&A, are there success stories? And Rodney said, well, wait till you hear about what they did in Annapolis. So there you go. Those, thank you for sharing, as you said, kind of the bottom line, what did FEMA like and what needed to be dealt with more seriously. You can see it is a big process. It's even more in-depth and more complex than I think it has been in the past, because there is such a requirement now for community engagement. And if folks want to go ahead and put their video on so we can see everyone, that would be great. I don't know if we need to give permission or what, but let's, so we can see all our speakers, as we're having a few opportunities for questions. So folks had also asked, particularly the Weston and Sampson folks, if you all had worked yet in Virginia. So I will let you all answer that. Well, maybe quickly, just now, if you want to have you had some projects in Virginia.
Yeah, I saw that in the chat. The examples we provided are applicable to Virginia. I mean, this is HMP guidance is a federal guidance, so we provided stories and examples from some of our most recently learned lessons from going through this with the new guidance from FEMA that includes the climate change components. So we think they're applicable to share with you folks. And it sounds like Annette Resilient Academy is going to have some really great additional sessions later in May and June. That's going to have a lot more Virginia specific data for folks to respond to and hear about.
Yes. And a few other quick observations or questions. I know Speaker Pollard weighed in on the slow process by which the floodplain maps are updated and the need for more accurate, more accurate information, thus faster updates. So that was a comment there that I'm sure the FEMA folks are aware of. Let's see, another question was, is there specific money for planning for populations with disabilities? And again, so it says Anna's video is prohibited from turning on. She can't not for some reason turn on her video. So we apologize for that. I don't know if Jerry in the background there can help in any way. At any rate, planning for populations with disabilities. So I know that Debbie Messmer answered that and said there's not specific funding just for that, but it certainly should be part of, as various folks have said, part of looking at your demographics and who are your most vulnerable in the population side of things. So that is something that that needs to be addressed in the process. Again, and again, we apologize for Anna. I'm not sure why we could not get your video on, but let's go on and kind of wrap up as we are. Let's see, we have another question here in the chat. What about mitigation for future plan developments? And I know that's a very interesting topic, as various communities are going through comprehensive planning processes now. And that does speak to looking at, as again has been mentioned, the effect of change in development, thus land use. Is there more, are there more buildings, roads, and non-permeable surfaces in the area? So I don't know if, Rodney, can you speak to that quickly, as far as it's part of the, it looks like it's one of the things that needs to be considered in the planning.
Sure. Yeah. If there's an identified, like, adopted future development plan, you would definitely want to include that in your future assets and look at, is that development in an exposed area or exposed to a hazard? Yes, so definitely we're looking at recent and planned.
Okay, great. And I think that's something, again, that since we work across sector here, both with community members as well as local government, I think the community members are particularly probably maybe interested in hearing that needs to be a part of it. And it affects, again, not only hazard mitigation plan, but looking at what's the language in your comprehensive plans to deal with development and land use and that sort of thing. So it can certainly work to affect a number of different planning processes in a community. Well, I'm sorry, we're going to wrap up here with, but we did have some good questions. I know folks did get some answers out in the Q&A. Questions were answered, and we'll do our best to share the questions and the answers with our audience. We really want to thank our speakers, and if we can pull up our slides, Trish, I don't know can you pull up the final slides? I think we'll just look to the future here briefly, but as we mentioned, May 28th will be the session that speaks on various tools. So both Virginia-based tools and platforms for resiliency planning, as well as the various of the FEMA ones. As we saw, there are many. We can't address them all, but there are many. And then the final session, we're going to be looking at the Mid-Atlantic RESA's CHAMP tool for local hazard mitigation planning, and really kind of go more in depth on that particular tool as a kind of a working demonstration of that. I do want to just point to our current efforts. We're having our current projects. We're having the ongoing work of the Resilient Virginia Collaborative Alliance that is focused on central and western part of the state. There are a variety of working groups in process now, one on water infrastructure, very relevant to this session, as well as clean transportation. And we're looking to put in place a working group on agriculture and climate impact, as well as emergency preparedness and hazard mitigation planning. So you can see more information on that at resilientvirginia.org. And there is a contact, RVCA, at resilientvirginia.org for Brendel Wolf, who is the project coordinator. We do want to point to our resource hub, which also has a funding hub section, which has some of the many sources of funding information, both from federal and state levels. And we have a special session outside of the Resiliency Academy on May 30th, noon to 1, which will look at, again, specifically funding for climate-ready communities. So we won't focus so much on the FEMA one. We talked about that a lot today. We'll be looking at other funding. We are doing this in conjunction with the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. And that will be interesting, again, to look at the wide range of funding coming through a variety of federal agencies, as well as our state agencies. So in closing, thanks so much for your time. Thank you to the speakers, the sponsors, and we want to just say this is our 10th year that we are celebrating this year. So do help us to work toward 10 more years of providing great resources to Virginia communities. Consider becoming a member or sponsor today. So thank you so much for your time, and we invite you to take a brief exit survey. Take care and have a good afternoon.